Procrastination is the avoidance of doing a task which needs to be accomplished.
I am making a video game where the basic premise is that you have a bunch of abilities per level, but the catch is that you can only switch your ability once you die. And this is part 3 of my Devlog series. Hi, today we're talking about abilities, and I'll probably call them power-ups accidentally a couple times in this video. So I kind of just cleaned them up basically, and I made a couple new ones. So I just call this one a priest because why the fuck not? I'll talk about the idea behind abilities a bit later, but basically this is the priest power-up, and what it does is that when you die you just fly around for a bit. Yeah, it took me like forever to implement. Also have another one which lets you like kind of pick up stuff, but I'll probably not use this one. I'll just use some sort of a variation of it. So for example, an ability that just when you spawn you're carrying a boulder or something and you can drop it, but you can no longer pick it up. Whenever you spawn with the ability, you just get another boulder. That's probably the most realistic. And also I can add a catch that your jump is decreased while you're carrying the boulder or something. So first let's talk about what actually defines an ability. So here is just a scriptable object that I used in Unity, which is actually really useful. It's just a way to store data that isn't bound to anything. And if you're using Unity, I suggest you use them. Basically, this is the default ability, like ability that doesn't have any ability whatever. It has just some graphic data, which is these sprites. This is the default player character. Also has the idle animation that you have seen before, which is just the character moving up and down, and also some colors, which don't really matter in the default ability. And having this sort of data makes it really easy to add any new abilities. So for example, the dash ability, it has a dash of course, but in terms of animation, it just has a cape. So if I look at the dash ability, I just added the back sprite. And whenever I set the actual sprites for the player, I just merge them with the default ability data. And this makes it really fucking easy to do stuff. Same for the priest power up. I just added a hat and a clothes sprite. So the default hat that the player had was changed, but the clothes were added. It's kind of the same idea for animations. So for example, this is the ability that I just called special, and I'll talk about it a bit later. But if you look at its data, it has just different eyes, just weird ass eyes, and a different idle clip, which is just the head moving like this. And for the same way, the idle clip is overwritten, and there's no extra logic in the special ability script to use this idle clip. I just assign it here, and the part that is responsible for the animations just looks at the ability data, and if it sees some sort of a clip, then it just tells the animator to use it. I'm using an animator override controller, which is created on runtime. Anyway, I also want to talk about like the art direction. So obviously I'm using pixel art, but you can obviously see that the character itself isn't pixel aligned. He can move in any direction by like half a pixel or something, and you can see that his pixels and the checkpoints pixels are in different locations, and I think that's fine. It allows me to have smooth movement, and I think that's better than just trying to make it all fully pixelated. Same for the particles. Their size is 2x2 pixels, and even though they're pixel sized, they move smoothly in any direction, so I think that's also fine. In terms of character outlines, I'm using black outlines, and I made this rule for myself, which is basically that anything that has a physical hitbox, it should have a 2-pixel outline. By default, the character itself here has a 2-pixel outline because he's a physical character. The other parts, like the hat, it doesn't have a hitbox. The character hitbox ends here, so the hat doesn't have to be a 2-pixel outline. Same here, like it's not a hard rule, but it's some sort of a soft rule. The character body has a hitbox, but the clothes don't have a hitbox, so that's why I made them 1 pixels. Same for the checkpoint. Anything that's interactable has a 1-pixel outline, so I can interact with it. And this thing might just seem like details, but it's real important when you have more things happening in the background and all around. It's very important for the player to be able to figure out what's a object that he can interact with and what's an object that's an actual physical object, and etc. I'm just preparing for the future by making some sort of a soft rule for myself in terms of making graphics. And here, for example, you can see the lever. Its outline is the same as the player's, which is 2 pixels wide. You can interact with it, but it's not a physical object. You cannot like jump on it. So this is incorrect. And in the future, when I'll be making a proper lever graphic, then I'll change it to have a 1 pixel outline. And here, for example, this is a pressure plate, and the shit like took me forever to figure out. I just legit like spent like 5 hours on the pressure plate. I was trying to make it an actual physical object instead of just a thing that stands still. So you would be able to rotate it, and you can probably be able to pick up and move it, which would be really cool. But I wasn't able to do that. At some point, I just made a pressure plate that's a physical object, and I tried to rotate it, and the thing is that it didn't rotate back for no reason. There was no force applied to it, and it fell on the ground, and it just stayed still instead of rotating back to a flat angle. I have no idea why that happened, so at that point, I just kind of gave up. Might come back to this in the future, but for now, it's just gonna stay like this. Anyway, it has a 2-pixel outline because it's an actual physical object that you can interact with, and that's good. I think this is a fine sprite for a pressure plate. One more thing in terms of pixels is that in the future, if I'll be planning to add lighting, which I probably am going to, then the lighting will not be pixel sized. It will be just like in the clip that I'm showing you right now. And I think that it's also fine, but I'm still not sure. That's a thing in the future that I'll have to think about more clearly, but doesn't matter right now. One more thing is the level theme, and for the first levels I'm hoping to have a theme that is just a cave or something. That's why I have a miner hat on the character. But these abilities that I have right now, they're not cave themed, and honestly I was like really hitting my head on the wall. I wanted to have abilities that are at least a bit themed towards the level style, which would be the cave. And then I kind of realized that this is some stupid fucking wacky 2D game that is made of pixel art and that it doesn't matter. So then I decided to just have some really wacky, dumb as shit abilities, and that's why the priest ability just it's you having church clothing and then turning into a ghost, and I think that will fit my game perfectly. But now we can talk about how I actually make the way to make the player move like this after death. The basic idea is that when a player interacts with something that could kill him, it doesn't instantly die. It actually asks the ability if it's allowed to die. And if the ability says that you're allowed to die, which most abilities like the dash ability tells, yeah, you're allowed to die, then the player dies. This ability, it doesn't actually let you die. It just saves a time when the player was supposed to die. And then it waits for a certain amount. So if you look at the priest ability, the ghost timer is 1 second. So it waits for 1 second, and only after that 1 second. I think this would be better explained if I showed you the code. Here is the default ability class and just has the unspawn on kill callbacks. So whenever a player with that specific ability is created, these functions are being called. But the important one here is the attempt kill. So when the player is supposed to die, it just asks the ability if it's allowed to be killed. Here, so some weird logic with the damage colliders, but basically here I get the active ability and I ask it if it's allowed to be killed, and if it's allowed to be killed, then the level manager is told to kill the player. For the priest ability, it's a bit different. The attempt kill ability always returns false. That means the player won't die, at least not by himself. If the death time is a negative value, which by default it is, that means the player died for the first time. And if the player died for the first time, then it just sets some physics values in the player itself, which basically these things allow the player to move like that. Okay, we can look at the player and his physics. So for example, the jump force value, which is how hard he will jump, and the jump multiply value, which is by default 1, and whenever the player is jumping, the jump force is multiplied by the jump multiply. Same for the moving, there's a max speed and how fast the speed is being increased and decreased, and the max speed multiply and speed multiply, and in X and Y, and the Y value is negative because by default the player cannot move in the I value. And of course the rigid body, which is by default just the thing that handles your physics. So we can see that when we die, we set a rigid body gravity scale to 0, which means the gravity will not affect us. We set a speed multiply to 1 and 1 in X and Y, which means the player can move in the same speed in the X and Y coordinates. We set a rigid body to is kinematic, which basically just means that it can pass through walls. And then we set the jump multiply to 0, which means that the player cannot jump. But also the ability is allowed to manually override the animation clips. So the up, down, and idle animations are set to a null clip, which just means that the player will be in the default position. And you can see that I also disable move particles and play the death particles. There's some dumb fucking math here, but basically each frame I change the player's speed multiply. So we can see that if I just fully run to the left, then I'm going fast and then I slow down, which is how it's supposed to be. I still might tweak the values, but basically all these physics variables allow the ability to control the player in any way it likes. And this is just an example for that. And all the physics multipliers, values, whatever, they're being reset to default whenever the player spawns. The execution order is that when the player spawns, the player sets his default values. Then the ability is told that the player just spawned. And the ability, if it has any values that it wants to override, then it overrides those values. And if the player dies, like actually dies, then the player is told that it died. And in this case, the player just plays the death particles. And then once again, the ability is allowed to do whatever it wants. So for example, here, the death particles are played not on the actual death, but when the player actually dies, so when he disappears, the particles are not played. So here what happens is on death, the player started playing the death particles, but the ability was allowed to override those death particles and just stop them. That means they didn't play at all. And once again, I'm probably overcomplicating a very simple thing, but I think I made a pretty good system in which the ability has full control of the player, but also the player has enough default values that the ability doesn't have to fully control the player. It just has to set some certain variables and then the player does the rest, which makes adding new abilities very easy. And basically that was the main thing I procrastinated about. There's a similar thing with the particles. This is the double jump ability, so it has the first color purple and the secondary color black. So the player itself looks at those colors and it sets the color appropriately. But when the player jumps, the particles are being increased. So even though by default there's some sort of value of how much particles are there supposed to be, it's not a set in stone value. And the ability is allowed to decide how much particles are being played at any time. Anyway, we talked about how useful these abilities are, but now we're going to talk about how not useful they are. See, the thing is that since I'm making a puzzle game with levels, that means I can make the player use each and every ability. So that means I can make abilities that just jump lower. And if the puzzle level is made correctly, that means the player will not be able to beat the level without using the ability that just jumps lower. This is my first idea of a more creative ability that's just a debuff. Of course, you cannot see it right now, but this ability has inverted controls. So when I'm supposed to be going right, I'm going left and vice versa. And it doesn't add any puzzle elements. Like whatever you can do with a normal player, you can technically do with this ability. It's just more difficult in terms of mechanics, which leads me to my next point, levels. See, I just really want to have a level that's just one ability and it's this ability and it's some difficult platforming challenge that you have to do with inverted controls just for the hell of it. And if I'm planning to have linear levels, then having this sort of level in the middle of puzzle levels would be fucking stupid. A good example of non-linear levels that I know of is Baba Is You, which is basically just like a tree structure. So whenever you beat a level, you can go to the next one, but also sometimes after beating a level, you unlock multiple levels and then you can just go according to that. And there's also some zones that give you some sort of a star, and to be able to access some zone or some level, you also need some number of stars. Since making abilities it's not real difficult, that means in the final game I'll be able to make a lot of abilities. Shoving each ability like this inverted controls ability down the player's throat would not be good. So I want to have some filler levels that use some specific ability or some zones that use some specific ability. And if the player for some reason doesn't like that, then the player should be allowed to just skip that and go to a different zone that uses some sort of a different theme and shit like that. So I'm still not sure how exactly I'll organize the levels, but linear levels will not exist. Another thing I want to mention is the visualization of abilities. So you can see that the priest ability just has a fucking priest clothing, and from looking at it you would not be able to tell what it does. The dash ability, well, this cloak doesn't really look like a cloak. I just added it to show that I can add it. You might be able to figure out that this is a dash, but it's very difficult. Same for the inverted controls ability. You just have to play those abilities to figure out what they do, and I think that's also fine since I fucking hate tutorials. I think the only tutorial-ish I will have is basically when you're whenever you're over a lever, then the X button will show up, which basically just will say that you can press X to activate the lever. Same way with checkpoints. If the checkpoint is activatable, then an X will show up on the top or something. And of course, it might not be an X, it might be some other button that I decide to use. For abilities like the dash, I'll have some sort of a control section which will just say you can press Z to activate an ability. But that will be the only information, that you can press a button to activate something. It will not tell you what you're actually activating. And I think if I do it correctly, then it will not be too annoying to the player. In terms of the lever and the pressure plate, I'm hoping that I will be able to make good enough levels that you'll be just able to tell what the lever does and what the pressure plate does just by looking at the level and the graphics and shit like that. And for the end, here's a level-ish. It's not really puzzly, but I want to show an example how the pre-stability is supposed to be used. And you have one pre-stability and one Y key controls ability. So here is the one on the right and the lever is on the left. And the lever just creates a space on the ground here so you can jump down and get the win. After you die with the pre-stability, your velocity is constantly slowing down. So here, for example, if you want to touch the lever, you cannot just die and go down. You have to jump up and then go down and activate the lever. So that's kind of the idea behind the ability. It will take some brain power for the player to figure out that that's how it's supposed to be used, and it will take some skill to actually use it. That's the basic idea. And here, after you get the ball, you can just jump and shit. You can jump and win. So yeah, that's about it. I kind of took like 2 weeks to upload this video, and it might not seem like I added much, but I really added a shit ton in terms of code and the idea of the player initializing something and then the ability of overwriting it is just, it might seem simple, but it's really useful and it's really future proof. Yeah, hope you enjoyed. Leave a like if you enjoyed and have a nice day. The visualization I want to mention is the fuck